What if everything you believed about one of the world's oldest monarchies was just a carefully crafted illusion? For generations, the royal image was untouchable, flawless photos, polished speeches, perfect tradition. But what happens when the facade cracks? What happens when the story they've controlled for centuries suddenly collapses in a matter of days? Today, we uncover the moment when a royal institution stopped being just a symbol of power and became a deeply human story about truth, vulnerability, and family. This isn't just another palace scandal. This is a reckoning. For months, nothing remarkable happened. Paradoxically, that very lack of disruption became the most disquieting element of all. There were no breaking headlines, no sudden press conferences, no high-stakes royal announcements hinting at upheaval. The gears of monarchy turned on their familiar axis. Official duties were fulfilled with precision, public engagements unfolded according to schedule, and impeccably timed photographs arrived in the media to reassure an attentive public that stability still reigned. From afar, the world saw ceremony, polish, and impeccable control, a palace operating without blemish. But beneath that well-curated exterior, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift was taking place. It started as a whisper in the pattern of appearances and grew until it could no longer be ignored. Prince Louis, once the most radiant, the most photographed, and the endlessly discussed of the young royals, began to disappear from view. At first, it was almost unnoticeable. A misscheduled event here, a slightly altered family portrait there. His name continued to appear in official programs, but his presence in images, the visual certainty that reinforced his status, slowly evaporated. Taken individually, these changes seemed negligible, easily dismissed as ordinary scheduling quirks. Viewed together, however, they formed a tapestry of absence that keen observers found too consistent to ignore. In the world of royal optics, where every gesture and image is meticulously calibrated, patterns are seldom accidental. Years of institutional choreography had trained the public to look for the intended narrative, a smiling family, poised and unshaken, the embodiments of continuity. In stark contrast, however, the visible absence of one key figure began to register not as an anomaly, but as an omission loaded with meaning. Papers and programs listed his name, but the frames shown to the world offered no trace of him. As quiet curiosity metastasized into public fascination, the palace responded with its well-rehearsed language, careful, composed, and reassuring, yet curiously elusive. Each clarification was comprehensive enough to soothe the casual observer, but strategically vague to avoid revealing any substantive detail. With every question posed by the press and every follow-up demanded by the public, the responses grew softer, more guarded, until silence itself became the most resonant message. It was not anger that fermented in the collective mind, nor outright protest. It was an intuitive sense that something had been withheld, that some deeper truth had slipped beneath the official line. Then came the photograph that would change everything, a family portrait intended to reaffirm unity, harmony, and royal affection. What should have been a reaffirmation instead triggered widespread skepticism. Photographers, analysts, and online commentators dissected the image, the carefully chosen setting, the way the light fell, the angles of posture, and above all, the conspicuous absence of one presence that had long been central to the family's visual identity. Where he should have stood, there was nothing but empty space. What had once been background detail now read like deliberate composition. The palace's response was swift but contained, a brief statement about a period of family privacy. Yet instead of quelling the swelling questions, the explanation only deepened curiosity. A period of quiet from what? Why at this specific moment, amid a carefully maintained schedule of public appearances? The statement, crafted to reassure, instead posed more questions than it answered. Meanwhile, Catherine's public visibility underwent its own metamorphosis. Where she had once been a fixture on the ceremonial stage, now she appeared with greater caution and restraint. And not only did her appearances become fewer, the way she moved through them changed too. No longer did she enter via traditional ceremonial routes that welcomed the world's gaze. Instead, she was seen slipping through private access points, bypassing the grand staircases and photo-op entrances of old. The shift was subtle, a deviation in path, a change in security protocol, but unmistakable. And then came the image that crystallized the growing sense of unease. Catherine, emerging from a pediatric medical center, flanked only by a minimal, highly discreet securite. Why detail no entourage, no official briefing, no photographers waiting to capture the moment for the evening news? At first, the photograph moved quietly through social feeds, barely noticed. But as questions began to surface, it spread with unexpected momentum. Why had there been no official notice? Why had the palace neither confirmed nor explained the visit? Why did the usual channels of communication remain closed? Inside the institution itself, whispers spoke of a sudden shift in tone. Conversations once open and procedural had grown guarded and brief, like fragments of strictly controlled dialogue. Access points were tightened, routes monitored more closely. A sense of precaution, not just protection, began to take hold. Sources familiar with palace operations described the atmosphere as tense, unprecedented, and unlike anything seen before in recent memory. What was once seamless and confident had become taut and watchful, like a room holding its breath before an inevitable revelation. What had once been routine and effortless inside the palace walls had become painstakingly meticulous. Where communication had once flowed with confident precision, it now felt regimented, clipped, constrained, and almost clinical. Conversations that used to feel warm and collaborative now took on a tone of procedural detachment. Behind the smooth veneer of official statements, subtle fissures were beginning to show, small but unmistakable signs that something beneath the surface was unraveling. Then came the moment that escalated everything, a seemingly insignificant administrative error that exposed far more than was ever intended. A confidential internal document, one meant strictly for a handful of senior aides, was mistakenly emailed to far more recipients than it should have been. It wasn't a strategic leak, and no one had planned for it to go public, but once it was out, its contents were telling. The text was written in a tone devoid of warmth, almost antiseptic in its language. It referenced developmental monitoring schedules, clinical observations, and ongoing pediatric assessments. On its own, it might have seemed like nothing more than bureaucratic language, but what caught attention and challenged assumptions was the context in which Prince Louis's name appeared. The procedural notes spoke not only of logistical planning, but also of controlled disclosure and media strategies that sounded more suited to crisis management than to routine family affairs. Although the document was never formally published, murmurs of it began circulating behind palace walls. Word of its contents leaked into the wider public consciousness through summaries and second-hand accounts. It wasn't long before questions started to circle far beyond the intended audience. In response, the palace moved quickly, but with an air of unease that hadn't been apparent before. Internal channels of communication were strengthened, and permissions to sensitive information were tightened. Even trusted aides who had long stood at the center of palace operations found their access restricted. King Charles urgently summoned senior officials for an emergency meeting. In closed-door discussions, emissaries stressed the need for unified messaging and tighter control over all external communications. On the surface, the monarchy's outward demeanor remained calm and composed, but inside the palace, the very foundation of royal certainty seemed to tremble. Behind closed doors, uneasiness began to grow into something more substantial. And then came a moment that marked a clear turning point in the story: Catherine's quiet absence from a meeting that was supposed to be pivotal. There was no official explanation for her absence, and strikingly, no one offered one. It was not written off as a scheduling conflict or simple logistics. In the world of royalty, absence speaks louder than presence, and in this case, the silence around her whereabouts was louder still. In families bound by tradition and expectation, distance, particularly unexplained distance, carries a unique weight, one that often signals hidden truths far more compelling than any formal declaration. Speculation began to swirl. Observers on the outside started to notice minute changes, subtle shifts in timing, gentle alterations in body language during public appearances, pauses that didn't belong there. What at first might have been dismissed as coincidence or misinterpretation slowly took on an unsettling clarity. This was no longer merely about a hidden health concern or a temporary hiatus. It was a narrative reshaping itself, from one of quiet discretion to one of carefully managed image control. The absence of Prince Louis, once an unremarkable omission, now appeared deliberate. The pictures changed. The way the family was presented shifted in tone, softer, more measured, and more calculated. What had once looked like protection now began to feel like containment. It was no longer about shielding a young life from public scrutiny so much as preserving a carefully constructed image, even if that image was at odds with what people felt they were being shown. In that moment of recalibration, everything shifted, because containment is not simply about shielding vulnerability, it is about safeguarding reputation. And when reputation becomes the priority, transparency fades, and the structures that once upheld authority begin to feel brittle. The palace, long a symbol of tradition, discipline, and unshakable hierarchy, now found those very pillars under strain. Reports leaked of conversations among aides about how best to limit internal access and manage narratives. What was once an institution focused on presenting a polished public front had become increasingly preoccupied with controlling every external perception. This wasn't just a matter of politics or PR anymore. It was about the tension between truth and image, a tension that the royal house had until now managed through carefully orchestrated tradition. But as the story deepened and the public became more attuned to the subtleties, it became clear that the palace was no longer merely trying to manage a message. It was trying to contain a story that had already escaped its control, one that was no longer theirs to shape. Then came an unforeseen revelation that transformed private vulnerability into a seismic public moment. During what was meant to be a routine reorganization of private quarters at Kensington Palace, a personal letter was discovered, not a formal memo or a polished statement, but a handwritten note addressed to William in Catherine's unmistakable script. There was no seal, no emblem, no ornate crest, just her handwriting and the quiet truth of a mother's heartfelt thoughts. What lay upon that page was a stark contrast to the carefully curated image the palace had spent months projecting. Instead of polished phrases crafted for headlines, it spoke in plain, raw language about long nights at a child's bedside, about emotional exhaustion, and the quiet, relentless tension of trying to reconcile family life with the weight of public expectation. It was not political rhetoric or calculated strategy. It was the private outpouring of a parent carrying burdens few outside her inner circle had ever seen. Yet the letter did what no official announcement could. It opened a fissure in the palace's carefully constructed narrative. Though never formally published, the note leaked into the public sphere through second-hand summaries and whispered retellings, and once it began circulating, its impact was immediate and profound. The polished facade, long held up by disciplined press releases and scheduled appearances, suddenly seemed brittle, fragile, and deeply human. What had been safeguarded behind layers of protocol and strategic silence was now laid bare, and the institution itself, not just its spokespeople or ceremonial functions, was put under scrutiny. Silence, once a cornerstone of the monarchy's communications doctrine, was no longer a shield. It had become a vulnerability. The strategists who had leaned so heavily on restraint and composed public messaging now found those very tools working against them, as truth, once voiced, even inadvertently, refused to be smoothed over or contained again. The public gaze shifted from mere curiosity to deep, sustained interest, not only in the health and well-being of the family, but also in what the institution represented and how it responded to human frailty. The monarchy, long seen as a bastion of unshakable tradition and composed continuity, suddenly appeared vulnerable under the weight of its own silence. Catherine's voice, once hidden beneath layers of discretion and carefully framed appearances, cut through the static. Her words, spoken indirectly through that simple letter, resonated with people in a way that no official communiqué ever could. She gave the public a glimpse of a reality that was both deeply intimate and universally relatable, the experience of love, fear, exhaustion, and fierce maternal devotion. This emotional truth upended centuries-old assumptions about monarchy and its role in public life. The institution that had long relied on an image of unassailable stability now found itself confronting its own fragility. Suddenly, the monarchy was not simply the custodian of tradition. It was a living, breathing entity grappling with authenticity, vulnerability, and moral clarity. What once seemed like preservation through quiet restraint began to look more like evasion. In a world where transparency increasingly shapes trust, silence ceased to be an asset. It became the monarchy's most conspicuous weakness. For the public, the effect was transformative. People began to see the royal family not as distant icons encased in ceremony, but as human beings facing challenges that went far beyond scripted appearances. Catherine's situation illuminated that even figures enshrined in history and ceremony experience the same emotional complexities that ordinary families navigate every day. The protective walls of tradition and protocol were no longer impermeable. They were permeable, susceptible to the emotional truths that resonate with people not because they are royal, but because they are real. As conversations once confined to private corridors erupted into the public square, the monarchy was compelled to respond not just to speculation, but to consideration deeper, more reflective, and more demanding than ever before. Suddenly, the questions were not just about what was hidden, but about why it was hidden and at what cost. The letter's unguarded honesty forced a reckoning, not just for the individuals involved, but for the institution itself. It had entered a new terrain where emotional truth demanded acknowledgement, and silence could no longer suffocate the rising chorus of voices seeking clarity and compassion. In this new environment, the monarchy stood at an inflection point. No longer merely a symbol of continuity or tradition, it now faced the challenge of reconciling its historical identity with the emotional realities laid bare by Catherine's story. Her unintended disclosure didn't shatter the monarchy, it redefined it, revealing that even the most historic institutions are vulnerable to human truths that cannot be hidden once they are spoken. The narrative that had been so carefully cultivated over generations, polished, controlled, and protected behind layers of ceremony, unraveled in a matter of days. What had once been an unassailable image of poise and tradition suddenly looked fragile, like an old tapestry whose threads were pulled too tightly for too long. The monarchy, long perceived as a distant emblem of heritage and dignity, was now reflected back to the world with all the complexity, contradiction, and raw humanity it had worked so hard to conceal. In a single moment, the institution that once stood apart from societal scrutiny found itself face to face with that very society, not as an exalted image, but as a human story with emotional weight and moral depth. As the public's gaze shifted from idle curiosity to piercing scrutiny, the monarchy reached a point of profound ambiguity. What had once been perceived purely as duty, the preservation of tradition, the protection of reputation, the careful management of public perception, now posed a deeper moral dilemma. Could the institution continue to shield itself behind protocol while the truth stretched taut at its edges? Could silence still serve as its primary defense when voices of vulnerability demanded acknowledgement? For the first time in living memory, these questions were no longer whispered behind palace gates but spoken openly in newspapers, on social media, and in everyday conversation. The royal family found itself at a crossroads, not merely of image or influence but of identity. The palace had weathered scandals and scandals before, but this was different. This wasn't about a misstep or a breach of etiquette. This was a reckoning with the very core of what it meant to be a modern monarchy, in an age that prized transparency and emotional truth almost as much as it revered tradition. As the days passed, the pressure did not abate, it intensified. What had once been an institution impervious to public sentiment now found itself vulnerable to it. Catherine had not just shifted the narrative, she had transformed the space in which that narrative could exist. She had shown that beneath the crowns and protocol were actual lives full of doubt, resilience, fear, and fierce love. The public no longer saw monarchs as mythic figures framed by history. They saw them as people. They saw the weight on their shoulders, the exhaustion in their steps, the tension in their eyes. In the wake of Catherine's revelation, the monarchy was forced to confront its own evolving place in the world. The carefully constructed facade of perfection had shattered, and there was no way to fully rebuild it in its original form. The truth once spoken was like a stone dropped into water. Its ripples could not be contained. The institution now stood exposed to questions it could not simply deflect. What responsibilities did it owe to the people it represented? How could it balance the preservation of history with the moral imperative of honesty? How could it justify silence when that very silence had caused pain? People began to see the monarchy in a way they never had before, not as untouchable icons perched above society, but as a family with vulnerabilities and emotional landscapes as complex as any ordinary household. Fathers, mothers, siblings, children, each with their own internal struggles, became more real than any heralded title ever could. The institution, once defined by hierarchy and control, now found itself grappling with its own humanity. The questions that had once been whispered only in private salons and editorial footnotes, were now thrust boldly into the open. What began as a crisis of narrative had become a dialogue about truth, empathy, and shared experience. And for the first time in its long history, the monarchy had to answer those questions not as a distant symbol, but as a living institution intertwined with the emotional realities of the era. The old ways of guarding perception through silence had lost their power. People no longer wanted carefully worded press releases. They wanted honesty, not just polished answers, but open human truth. The monarchy could no longer exist only as a reflection of heritage and protocol. It had to reckon with the very real emotional world of the individuals it encompassed. In that moment of transformation, the monarchy stood not at its end, but at a beginning, a possibility of renewal grounded not in silence, but in sincerity. The institution that once saw vulnerability as a risk now faced it as a bridge to greater understanding. The questions that had once been suppressed were now the very ones demanding answers, not out of scandal, but out of a collective yearning for connection, compassion, and truth. And in answering them, the monarchy stepped out of its past shadows and into a future shaped not by tradition alone, but by the enduring humanity at its heart. If this story gave you a new perspective on how tradition, truth, and vulnerability collide in the world's oldest institutions, drop a comment below with your thoughts. Do you believe honesty can strengthen tradition, or will it forever change it? Backhand index pointing down, let the conversation begin. And if you want more deep, emotionally charged insights into royal life beyond the headlines, hit the like button and subscribe, because the truth behind the palace gates is more powerful than any press release.